Bon après-midi, tout le monde. Est-ce que vous êtes en forme pour reprendre le programme officiel? Je vous entends pas, mais je vous sens. C'est ça qui compte. Agile Tour 2021 se poursuit. Ça nous amène à la présentation de la première conférence d'après-midi qui a pour thème Why WIP Matters, présentée par Mme Colleen Johnson. À noter qu'il sera possible d'échanger avec Colleen via le chat. Je vous souhaite une bonne conférence. On se reparle tout à l'heure.
Hello, Agile Tour. My name is Colleen Johnson. I'm very excited to be speaking with all of you today. I hope you've had a wonderful day so far. We are going to be spending some time over the next hour talking about why WIP matters, why the work in progress we have is so important. A little bit about me and this session. I am coming to you all from Denver, Colorado, probably not quite as cold as Quebec yet, but getting there. I'm the CEO of Pro Kanban, which is an inclusive Kanban learning community, and I am the co-founder of Scatterspoke, which is a tool for more effective retrospectives. My most important job is mama to these three who are now 3, 11, and 13 and really keep me on my toes, especially going into what is going to be a very fun-filled Halloween weekend with kiddos. So looking forward to that. As we kick off this presentation here, I'll be taking some pauses throughout the talk to answer any questions that are coming up. Feel free to chat those questions up, and then when we pause, we'll have some help reading those off, and we'll take some questions throughout the presentation, then again at the end. So don't worry if you don't get them in at the beginning, you won't miss your chance to ask them. We'll close out with some more Q&A as well. So let's go ahead and start talking about work in progress. When we think about WIP, or what we think of with WIP, is any work that is started that has not yet been delivered, really anything. It can be paused, it can be blocked, it can be active work. All of that counts as work in progress. Another way to think of this is all the stuff that we start that we don't get delivered. In my household, this tends to be craft projects. That's the joke in my house. I tend to start a lot of craft projects or Agile books. I read probably 3/4 of all of my Agile books. So I have a lot of half-finished Agile books. All of those things contribute to my work in progress. But when we think about why work in progress is so important, and why we want to figure out how to control the amount of work in progress that we're tackling, why does it matter? Why should you care? Well, let's talk about capacity. The amount of capacity that we all have, whether it's individually, as a team, or as an organization, is limited. There's only so much output we can do, regardless of how much caffeine we consume. So we have to think about how do we match up our capacity by controlling the amount of work in progress so that we're not burning ourselves out. Easier said than done, right? Why is it so hard to do this? I think in general, we want to stay busy. We feel more productive when we're busy. There's a fantastic book called Making Work Visible by Dominica DeGrandis. And in that book, she talks about how hard it is to say no, especially to our teammates. We want to be a team player. We don't want to let anyone down. So it's very hard to say no, even if we're already really maxed out in terms of our capacity. Everything can be a top priority. I do a lot of coaching with security teams. This is certainly true in the security world. Everything that comes across their desks is often a very high priority. Unplanned work can come up. Unfinished work can get abandoned. And overall, we feel like we need to stay very busy to be valued in our team and in our organization. Probably one of the things that I hear most often from product owners is that they need work to keep their team busy. But what we want to think about as we talk about our work in progress is how do we focus on value and being productive instead of just staying busy? I want to kick this off with an airport example. I think it's something we can all relate to, maybe not much recently, but in the past. So when we think about our capacity here, I want you to think of a time that you've flown somewhere and you've landed at the airport. And when you've landed, they've come over the loudspeaker and said, we're going to have to sit here on the runway for 45 minutes, 2 hours, pick your number, because we don't have a gate to pull up to. Typically what that means is there's a bottleneck somewhere or something has happened and now your arrivals into the airport are outstripping the departures. Well, when you think about the capacity of the airport, it's limited right now, in this example, by the number of gates available for those arrivals and departures. When we think about how we work as a team and as an organization, we want to think about ourselves as that airport, right? There's only so much work that can come in. And as that work comes in, we have to balance it with the work that's leaving. If we're not acknowledging the amount of arrivals and departures into our system, work's going to pile up somewhere on that runway, right? So how do we start to think about throttling the work coming in and coming out so that we're balancing those arrivals and departures? Well, we're going to do that by thinking about the amount of work that's in progress. We're going to go through 4 key areas here today, and I want to talk about focus, flexibility, follow through, and predictability. And as we look at how we control the amount of work in progress that we have, we're going to talk about how it impacts these 4 elements. When we think about focus, flexibility, follow through, and predictability, your head's probably going straight to your team or your company and how you deliver value. But instead today, I want to use some examples of things that are in our everyday life. We tend to always fall back on software development examples today. I want to use some examples in your home, the airport, things that you'll see every day so that these will help you remember why WIP is so important. So let's start with focus. All right, so we are, I think it's already been Canadian Thanksgiving, is that correct? I think that's already taken place. We're getting ready to have Thanksgiving in the United States. And so when we think about Thanksgiving, I love to cook the Thanksgiving meal. We're going to be welcoming some guests for the holiday. I have a very old house and a very small kitchen. So one of the first things that I have to figure out, in addition to what my menu is going to look like, is the order that things are going to go in and out of that oven. My capacity in this example is limited by the fact that there's one oven and a lot of stuff that needs to go into that oven to make my meal successful. And the minute we start to think about limiting the capacity of something, it forces us to make decisions about what's the highest priority item, right? And to focus on that priority. So I often get up at 5 a.m. to get my turkey in the oven because that's the highest priority for my menu. So think about how that works for your team. The minute we limit the capacity of what we can work on, we have to pick the highest priority items to work on next. So immediately, this starts to bring focus. It's bringing focus to what we're doing. The goal here in that focus and that attention is that we're minimizing multitasking and context switching. We're getting rid of overburdening in one part of our system. So, and this is so true right now, right? Where we have somebody who's working extra hours or working overtime or working more than they need to be to try to clear out blockers. If we can all be focused on one thing together, we can work together to get that over the finish line. Focus also helps us identify opportunities for process improvement. So when there's less going on, it's easier to see where those blockers are or where things are coming up that need attention. And this is very true for management and leadership too. When we think about things at a feature level or an epic level, the more we have in flight, the harder it is to see where our problem areas are. By reducing the amount of work that we have going on at any given time, it makes it easier to identify the root cause of what's causing some of our process issues. Focus and less in flight also helps us identify capacity constraints. And so a lot of times this really just means, do we have maybe one part of our system or one part of our flow or team where we need more help? Maybe we need more QA, and we can see that now more clearly because we have less in progress. And overall, this helps create unified goals for the team. one of the things I think that's so important as we start to reduce the amount of work that we have in progress is shifting our thinking from delivering as an individual to delivering as a team. A lot of I grew up in the software industry in QA. That's where I got started. And a lot of times from a QA perspective, you're spending, especially in waterfall, you're spending a lot of your time waiting for something to test. When we think about what happens here when we're all focused on delivering together, it gets you closer to the development cycle, right? So I'm not spending so much time waiting for something to do. We start to focus on how we're going to work together. So how do you do this? How do you put this into practice? If we're going to minimize multitasking, we want to focus on that shared ownership of work. That can be through things like pairing or swarming. And what we want to focus on then is how are we completing things together rather than checking off individual tasks. What I want to avoid from teams I work with is ever hearing somebody say, well, my part's done, so I'm going to start working on the next thing because I have nothing to do for the work that's on the board. How do we start to create that sense of shared ownership for all of the work so that I'm looking at a way to help with something else on the board to help get something over that finish line? We want to reduce the spread of work. So a second thing that you can do right away is we tend to think of WIP as just what's in our team's board, right? How much work in progress does my team have? But what we can often see when we pull up a level from that, or even a level from that, is that maybe we only have 5 user stories in progress, but it's across 5 different features and 5 different epics. How do we start to reduce the spread of all of that work as we scale up in the hierarchy of the work that we're pulling in? And that's a great way to help minimize multitasking across the organization too, not just the team level. And the last thing here that you can do is start to look at wait states, dependencies, or pileups in your process as opportunities for improvement. A lot of times these look like things where you're waiting for approvals or waiting for another team or waiting for sign-offs. How do you look at those all as an opportunity to bring more focus to working on the same things together? And when we think about focus, focus really comes down to saying no. How are you going to say no to something that's coming in? I know this is a hard thing in the business world. And so sometimes what we mean when we say no is actually just not yet. It's not that we're not going to do that work. It's that we're not going to do that work until we have the opportunity to complete something else. I want to pause here and see if anyone has any questions about focus and limiting WIP.
For now, we have no question about, no question, just hello and hi. So
Great.
we're good to go.
All right, let's talk about our next example. My next example is also food related. So I don't know, maybe I'm just hungry. I'm hungry sitting here working. I don't know if anyone has seen these snacks. So they are like squeezy pouches of chia seeds and blackberry goo. I mentioned that I live in a very old house and we have very limited cabinet space. And we went to Costco and the kids convinced me that we should get these snacks. Well, of course it's at Costco. So I think the box has like 80 of them. It's a huge box of these. And it turns out they're disgusting and no one will eat them. No one in my house will eat them. So what happens is now I have this giant box of these squishy chia blackberry goo pouches eating up probably a quarter of one of my shelves. And I don't have any room for any other snacks in the kitchen. So what happens here is I've overcommitted, right? I've overcommitted by taking on too much inventory in that finite space. And it's created inflexibility for me. I can't switch directions. I can't switch my snacks because I've got so much inventory of one thing. And when you think about this from a work perspective, when we pull more in, it creates more inflexibility for what we're working on because it's harder to change directions. If we can't use what we're building or sell, and change direction and respond to customers because we've got so much work in flight, it means that we've lost the ability to be agile in a lot of ways. So what does this mean if we're trying to be more flexible or more agile? If we're trying to create flexibility, the first thing we want to do is reduce the amount of change that we have in flight. And think of anything that's in flight in your organization as inventory. It's inventory and code change that has not yet been delivered. So that's all risk that you're sitting on. The less work that we have in flight at any given time creates opportunity to reprioritize. I mentioned I've been doing a lot of work in the last couple of years with security teams applying Kanban, and it's become so important for them that by reducing the amount of work that they have in flight, that they can be more responsive to urgent matters when they come up. They don't have the flexibility to say no or not yet. So they have to be able to respond to urgent security matters when they happen. They create that flexibility and ability to respond more quickly by having less in flight. This also helps us focus on just-in-time definition. And so one of the things I think many organizations struggle with is over-planning or planning way too much work up front, right? So we try to have 3 months of backlog or 6 months of backlog ready to pull. And by the time we go to pull those things, we don't totally remember what they are. They may not be relevant. They may not even be what the customers want anymore. Having less in progress allows us to focus more time on just-in-time definition. So we can balance what we're doing now with what's coming next and defining that work right before we're going to pull it in. And I mentioned here, like the security teams facilitating unplanned and urgent work. This makes it a lot easier for us to accommodate work like that when we have less in progress, because there's less to try to finish, right? A lot of times when there's a ton of work in progress, I might have my name on 3 or 4 items, but I'm really only actively working 1. And so if I'm going to pull something unplanned in or urgent in, there's still 3 other items that are sitting there not getting worked. By reducing the amount of work that I have individually or as a team in progress, it gives me more of an option to pull those unplanned items in when they happen. So how can you do this? How can you start to create some flexibility? Well, the first thing I think is to plan new work based off of capacity rather than cadence or calendar. So I mentioned that concept of trying to have 3 months of work in the backlog or even quarterly planning sessions. What often happens when we plan off of a calendar or off of a fixed cadence like this is the minute we start work, we're behind, right? Or we're starting to plan things and we haven't delivered what we planned for the last quarter. So we're already starting behind for that time block or that time period. When we start to plan based on capacity, we don't pick what the next thing is that we're going to pull until we have space to pull it. Another way to think of this, we'll go back to our airport example. When you go to leave the airport and you've got all the bays to pay for your parking, I'm the car that sits all the way at the back because I don't want to commit to the parking queue that's going to have a broken credit card scanner and not be able to, and get stuck in this line where everyone's trying to back out because we've committed and now we can't go through that stall. When we plan based on capacity, we're deferring that commitment to the last responsible moment so that we're not picking until we're ready to pull. This is a great thing for teams that have to deal with a high volume of bugs too. So rather than planning out what I'm going to do for the next sprint or for the next day even, I'm waiting to see when we have capacity, what's the most important item that is relevant at that point in time when the capacity is also available. The second thing is to define your work as close to the time that the work will start as possible. I think we love to plan, everyone loves to plan. When we think about planning here, we're often planning work that we might not see for 3 months or 6 months down the road. And that ends up losing a lot of value. Teams change, priorities change, code changes. So if we can plan our work right before we're going to start, chances are it's going to be far more relevant when we go to pull it in. The team will remember what they're working on and they'll be able to define that work with the most recent information from what they're working on. So when they pull it in, they're ready to get going. And the last one here is so important. We talk a lot about stories being as small as possible and still being valuable, but this scales up. And is just as important as we scale up the type of work that we're working on. When you think about features or epics or initiatives, whatever your hierarchy looks like, it's so important that each of those items, and we'll refer to that as a batch, you could also refer to your release as a batch, is as small as possible. The bigger we make these things, the harder it is for us to be flexible in what we're working on. I mentioned at the beginning that I'm the co-founder of Scatterspoke, which is a a retrospective software company. It's so funny, I work with so many teams where I'm coaching to this, but being on the software development side of things has really taught me a lot about how hard it is to put any of this into practice. Number 3 here, I think, is the thing that we've struggled with the most in building software and deploying software, because you get excited, right? And it's like, well, we're building a new way to manage action items. So let's add due dates, let's add assignees, let's add reminders, let's add all these things in. And slowly it grows and grows and grows and takes longer to deploy. And then that means when somebody has a request for something new, we can't address that request because we're working on this giant growing epic of things around action items. Keeping your batch size as small as possible is going to give you more opportunities to change direction and pivot what you're working on. Easier said than done, though. I'll admit to that. It wouldn't be a Kanban talk without some information here from Taiichi Ohno. And this quote is that the more inventory a company has, the less likely they will have what they need. So the more that we have going on, the less likely we are able to do what our customers need from us in the moment. I'll pause here and see if there's any questions about the concept of flexibility.
Yes, we do. We do actually have 4 questions. So let's go with the first one. Won't throttling the arrival and departure reduce the overall output of a team?
No, actually. So without going too far down the Little's Law rabbit hole, working on less typically increases your throughput. So by working on less, we tend to get more done. Now, there's no magic number here. That's always the first question that everyone has, is what's the magic formula for figuring out what that right amount of work is to have in progress at any given time? And it honestly depends. It depends on the nature of the work, the size of the work, the size of the team, the specialties of people on the team. What I will say is pretty true for everyone is it takes some trial and error. Try some things out and measure and rinse and repeat. So try out, maybe 1 ticket per person, or look at how many people are on your team and where there are specialties for folks on your team to determine, if you have a bottleneck with something like QA or something like design, where that there's a limited amount of capacity in that specific area of your workflow, then start there and work backwards to figure out what your work in progress limits should look like across your workflow.
Shall we go with another one, or you want to go on? Yeah,
let's
all
do
right.
one more.
So how to avoid multitasking and parallelism, how to focus when the members of a team have different skills, knowledge, and experience that encourage specialization or focus on what each person prefers to do.
Yeah, this is very hard. So, I think there's 2 parts. I think the focus on what you prefer to do piece is that notion of limiting your arrivals and putting a control on your, like your next to pull, your ready for development column, can really help narrow the focus of the team. I see a lot of teams that try to batch all their work, or even in a sprint, right, where you're going to pull 2 weeks worth of work in. There's always going to be a little bit of cherry picking, even if we don't mean to, right, to pull what we are the most excited to work on next. So by limiting the focus of the team and reducing that arrival amount to be roughly equal to the departure amount, you're throttling that and bringing the focus down to fewer items in the queue. I think the other thing here around specialties is really important, and it is unavoidable. You're always going to have specialties in the team, and I'm definitely not saying that your team needs to be, everybody on your team needs to be able to do every job. That's just not realistic. When we think about those specialties, though, it's important to understand the capacity of what can move through that state in your workflow. There's kind of 2 elements to this, though. It's also balancing the rest of the work in your system around that constraint. And then it's also starting to say, what other things can our team be working on other than pulling in new work? I started out my career way before I got into software. I worked in restaurants, and I worked in the back in the kitchen, and there's signs all over the kitchen that say, if you can lean, you can clean. So no breaks, basically. And think about that from a team perspective. I'm not saying that there's not something that you should stop working and sit on your hands. I'm saying what we should not do is start new work. There's often a lot of things that you can do to contribute to the health of your team and the ability to deliver great value without starting a new user story. look to unit tests, look to code reviews. Maybe you're doing research, maybe you're talking about a spike, or you're starting to do some backlog grooming on the next thing coming to your team. But what we're trying to avoid is starting more work that's going to get stuck in the system that may not be the right work for us to start next.
Thank you. Another question?
Sure.
All right. I find that the onboarding of new team members is where we have the hardest time with limiting WIP. We would like for the team to work together, but it's often easier to find easy things for the new members that they can do by themselves. I would like to hear you about the input on that.
Yeah, so for new team members, I think it can take a while before you increase your WIP control or your WIP amount. I usually wait a little bit and try to have them swarm or pair with other people. So hopefully not the easiest thing, but maybe a learning opportunity. And if that's a cultural barrier for your team or for your organization, I've often tried to make some of the things, and we'll talk about this in a moment here, like make some things different about how you're organizing around the work. I call it ticket squatting. So we tend to pull stories in and then it's my ticket, right, until I'm done with it. And a lot of teams, I think, really struggle with how to bring in help or how to, invite another developer in to help get something over the finish line. And I think trying to really encourage the concept of pairing on things when they are aging beyond a reasonable amount or when there's somebody new on the team is just a really great practice to get your team comfortable with.
And the last one, the issue often encountered is that there is no available resource with the skill to work on an item that is in progress. So it seems more efficient to start a new item where the resource will be used at its full potential. What are the counter arguments to this?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of goes back to the if you can lean, you can clean, right? The minute you start something, you're creating a bottleneck then somewhere in your system. So work is going to start to pile up. Like I mentioned, QA, I think, feels this very acutely for a lot of teams where there's just a lot more developers than there are QA folks. And development typically does exactly that. They're pulling more and more work into the system and it's piling up for that QA person and creating a bottleneck. As soon as you start to see that pile of work growing for QA, what's happening there is that work is aging, right? Our inventory is growing, going back to our gross chia pouches. The inventory is growing and it's making it harder for us to switch gears, and something is going to have to give to clear out that queue, right? If I see this growing pile of things as a QA person, I'm either going to have to work more hours to catch up. We're going to have to pull in extra people to help catch up. We're going to be working overtime and weekends or doing something extra to clear out that growing pile of things that because we have an imbalance there. So I think it is really important that you work with your team to help them see what's happening when they're consistently pulling in new work. And then, I've made it very simple. I'll work with a team to say, what things could we work on when this happens, right? And we'll put a ticket at the top of that column, depending on what tool we're using, that says, if we're at capacity, what are other things we could do? And I have the team create that list, right? The chances are everyone on your team could probably benefit from some slack in their day and some time to really focus and think creatively. So having them work together to come up with that list, I think gives them a lot of ownership over what those options could be. All right, I'll keep going here. We'll go to our next example. I wish I could see everybody for all these stories. Is there IKEA in Quebec? I don't know.
Yes, we do.
Oh, perfect. Okay. Well, this will work much better if you've been to an IKEA. Okay, so let's talk about capacity. We've spent a lot of time talking about capacity, and you'll start to see all these examples, I think, of where we're trying to limit capacity in real life. But probably one of my favorites is at IKEA. I mentioned at the beginning, I've got 3 kids. I love them so much, but one of my least favorite things on earth to do is to go into IKEA with them. They can touch everything. They can climb in everything. It's crazy. However, if you go into the IKEA, when you first come in on that ground floor, there's often a play place. I don't know if the one in Quebec has one, but you can check your kids in to play in the playground. There isn't a long, drawn out check-in process or system here, but there's a certain legal capacity of how many kids can be in that room per the given number of adults supervising them. And so when we start to think about how we're managing that capacity, they're doing that with a visual indicator, and they use these orange construction vests. So when you walk up to the play place, there's a rack hanging with all these construction vests. And if there's a vest, your kid can go play, they have capacity. If there isn't a vest, you're stuck shopping and climbing all over all the furniture with your kids. So what's happening here is by limiting the amount of work that we have in progress, it's creating pressure for us to complete something in order to create capacity for something new. So that question that we just talked about of, I don't have the skills to help maybe do testing. So I don't have the skills to help with testing. So instead of going to start a new story, because I'm creating that constraint where we don't want to start new work, I'm creating pressure on the team to say, what's something you could do to help create capacity for new work? Maybe it's helping with deployment pipelines. Maybe it's automating some tests so they don't pile up in QA. But so it's thinking through, like, what are other things that we could be doing? It's creating this pressure now to get something, to move stuff to the right so that stuff can move into our system. So this is creating follow through. Really at its core here, and I'm sure everyone has heard the mantra, stop, starting, start, finishing. This is what we're trying to drive. How do we drive work to done before we pull in something new? Doing this helps create a lot of visibility into what's happening in our system. Where is work getting stuck? Where are there blockers? We all have a tendency when we get stuck to want to start something new. So it's like, I can't work on this anymore. I'm going to move it out of the way, and hopefully we want to move it out of sight, out of mind, and start on the next thing that's available to us so we stay busy, right? But the minute we do that, we're hiding an opportunity to address probably a more systemic issue that's going on that's contributing to why that work is blocked or stuck. I hear a lot of teams that really struggle with this, and they'll say, you know, are you meaning that you want me to go to my manager or my director, my leader here, and tell them that this team's going to stop working because all of their work is blocked? And I think you have to shift your thinking away from it being about keeping your team busy or keeping you busy as a team to what is contributing to why all that work is blocked. If we don't elevate that or escalate the fact that something's contributing to everything being blocked for this team, then we're missing an opportunity to address that problem. And the more we cover up blockers by working around them, the more we're covering up that opportunity to address what's causing them. The other thing that this helps with is cycle time. So when you think about the time it takes for something from when we start it to when we deliver it, when we're focusing on getting things over the finish line to create that capacity or create more space to start something new, we're starting to drive down the time that it takes us, right? Because we're always focusing on getting something done. And this last one that you heard me mention with the concept of slack and study, but it's one of the things I hear so often from developers is that the more we try to keep them busy, the more we take the time for this critical thinking out of their day. We hire smart people, we seek out, we spend all this time and money and energy interviewing and hiring brilliant people to write code. And then a lot of times it becomes a code factory, right? Where we're just shoveling things through as fast as we can to make sure that we're maximizing their day. But what happens when we do that is we take away the opportunity for them to study and research and really be creative with what they're building. So how do we start to drive this focus on follow through? So we've talked about a bunch of these, but our overall goal here is how do we minimize starting new work? Kind of our last option should be pulling something new. The first thing you can do here is make your decision criteria visible and actionable. When we think about decision criteria, we want to think through the kind of conversations we have at our stand-up. How much work is left on this ticket is often one of the things that everyone asks. So is there a way for you to show percent complete and percent remaining, or how much effort is left so that you know where you can contribute? What you want to be able to do in these conversations around where I have, if I individually have capacity, instead of starting new work, I want to be able to go to my board and quickly see what the most important thing is for me to contribute to. In addition to what is, what might be left or what is blocked, one of the other most important criteria you can make visible is how old is something. So as we start to manage our work in progress, we also want to start a conversation around the work item age. And so if I have capacity, I want to be able to go to my board and say, this item has been in progress for 2 days and it's 30% complete. But this item's been in progress for 12 days and it's 80% complete. What can I do to help get that over the finish line, that older item? I mentioned this second one. I think that this is such a fun conversation to have with your team, but what are the opportunities for house cleaning, and make these part of your working agreements? It can be a great way for the team to identify either maybe tech debt items or code reviews or unit tests, or where they can be contributing to something like that that might not be starting new work. I like to encourage the team to look upstream on the board and think through what work is coming next, or maybe do any of those kind of reviews of stories that we might be grooming that week. But have your team help you make this list. Chances are they have a pretty big list of stuff that it's hard for them to get time to address. And then this last one here goes back to time. Actively manage the work that's aging beyond a reasonable amount of time. In Kanban, we call this a service level expectation, or an SLE. What's important though about your SLE is that the team agrees to that number and what they're going to do with it. When we think about coming to the board and looking at all this information, I'm sure a lot of you are experienced with JIRA. JIRA puts some lovely dots on the tickets to tell you how old things are, and a lot of tools have capabilities for showing you that a ticket is aging. But what often happens is the ticket turns red, or the dots turn red, and then they just stay red. The conversation you want to have with your team is, what do we do when we hit that threshold, or when we hit that service level expectation? Make that part of your working agreements as a team to say, these are the actions that we're willing to take when this happens. And it could be that we're going to stop and we're going to swarm the story or pair on the story, that you're going to review the story and see if it needs to be split up or made smaller. But agree with what actions you'll take, not just that you're going to make the card red. The card red is one half of that equation, but you want to know what you're agreeing as a team to do about it. So much of the stress that people feel doesn't come from having too much to do. It comes from not finishing what they've started. So again, think of the burdens that everyone is carrying from day to day. And I'm a list maker. I like to rewrite my lists every morning. I can definitely, this quote really resonates with me, because the bigger my lists are, the more stressed out I feel. And it's really all about all of that stuff that's half started and not completed. I'll pause here and see if anyone has any questions on follow through.
So we did have 2 questions from last chapter. Maybe I can keep them at the end and go on this one.
Yeah.
So you went through the heart of Louis Philippe with the work item age, my favorite metric. There's another question. How can you deal with the fact that our tasks are not created equals? Some tasks might take a day, other weeks. How can we find how many tasks a team can keep at the time if the tasks themselves are already varied in cost?
Yeah. All things will vary somewhat in cost and size and time, and that's okay. There's still only one of you. There's still only one team. And so when we think about the work that moves through our system, what we want to focus on is it as small as possible and still independently valuable? The minute we compromise that value by creating things that are almost too small, we start to create dependencies and pile-ups in our system. So we want to focus on, is it independently valuable to move through our workflow, but is it as small as possible? And to be really honest, whether your task takes you 2 hours or 2 days, there's still so much value in just focusing on one of those things at a time, right? Even if it's 2 hours, get it to done. The next one might be 2 days. There's always going to be some variability in your system, but what you're trying to do here is focus on getting things to a consistent batch size. So that's a great segue to this part. And batch size can be a story. So when we think about a story, we want to have the conversation around, does this meet, do we think we can get this done within our SLE or our service level expectation? Is it as small as possible? And is it still valuable by itself? When we think about batch size, are there any others, Nicholas, or should I keep going?
Oh, you can go. The other one was the same thing about the facts that our tasks are not equals. Oh,
Yeah.
how can you deal with the tasks are not equals for functional and technical capacity?
Yeah, and same answer here. They're not always going to be the same. There's going to be some variability there, but you want to focus on, are they as small as possible and still valuable? What you typically start to see is if you're keeping things as small as possible, they start to get more consistent in size. There's been some interesting work too done around things like story pointing, and even to show cycle time data against story pointing numbers tends to be like your story point value does not correlate to how long the tickets actually end up taking you. So trying to think about how to get them small and valuable is usually the most important effort here too. What you want to avoid is saying like, everything has to be 5 days, right? Because what happens as soon as we start to try to same size everything versus right size it for our system, when we same size things to a certain number, our cycle time often goes up from that number. And I'll use an example here of painting your house. If I were to ask everyone, how long would it take you to paint your bathroom? You might tell me, I don't know, there's only, there's 4 walls, one's a door, one's a shower. So there's not a lot of real estate. I think I can have the whole bathroom painted in 2 days. And I say, great, go paint your bathroom. And when you get in there, you have to take the shower curtain down and the medicine cabinet off the wall. And then you have to tape all these tiny corners around the bathtub. And your painting effort all of a sudden has gone from 2 days to 4 days because of all those extra tasks. The same thing happens when we ask a room full of developers, how long will this thing take? They're thinking about the time that it takes to roll the paint on the wall, not the time it takes to package, deploy, test, all these other activities that are included in the time it takes for us to get that story done. And so if we were to tell everyone, we want you to size all your painting jobs to 2 days, what we would see is that they all start climbing up from that because of all those other activities that have to happen. And so we don't want to same size items to an arbitrary number. We want to have this right size conversation around, is it the right size to go through our system, and is it as small as possible while still being valuable? All right, let's talk batch size here a little bit more. So what's exciting about batch size, and I had to look this up, my example here is based on Southwest Airlines. I don't think Southwest Airlines actually flies to Quebec. So I don't know if anyone has flown on Southwest. What is fun about Southwest Airlines is you don't get a seat number. You get a queue number. So when you get to the airport, your ticket might say that you are A15, and that is your queue in line to go get on the plane, but then you get to pick your own seat once you're in. And what's interesting about why Southwest Airlines manages these queues and this consistent batch size is because they have found that they can board the plane faster if they keep this batch size consistent than if they have everybody line up and try to get into a numbered seat. This allows them to turn over more flights each day because they're minimizing the amount of time that they're at the gate to board the plane for departures. So they're able to have more flights in and out every day, and then they make more money. So what's interesting about this batch size piece, right, is that they've found that by keeping it to batches of 30 people for each round, that it helps produce a consistent time interval at the end. And what this also means is if that is consistent, if your batch size is consistent and the time is consistent, we start to see that overall, this reduces that panic and stress and exhaustion that's created by trying to keep up. I have felt this even within a sprint, right? If you are in a sprint and you start all of your work at the beginning of the sprint and then nothing really moves to test until the end of the sprint, there's this like panic at the end to try to get all of those things over the finish line. And so by keeping our batch size consistent and managing the flow of work through by controlling our work in progress, we start to see that these things even out, that they start to get more consistent. And what that does is it starts to give us predictability. What we're trying to do here is reduce varied amounts of work. And so, I'll see a lot of teams that will put work in progress limits in place, and then they just break them all the time, which is, of course, an option, but I'll see that they go from like 4 one day to 8 the next day to 12 the next day and down to 2. So their amount of work is going up and down. And the minute you start to see that variability in the volume of work and the amount of work in the system, think of our queue at the airport. The minute that starts to change, the length of time that it takes to board that change or to deliver that ticket is going to change too. So if we want to be able to deliver with some level of predictability, we want to keep that amount of work in progress consistent. I know the whole world, I think, is burnt out right now. Like everyone is stressed and really fried, I think, from working at home and not having a lot of boundaries between work life and home life. And when you think about that ebb and flow of the volume of work, that's just contributing so much to that sense of stress and overburdening and feeling like you have to play catch up. So how do we look at controlling our work in progress also as a way to take care of the health of our team and of the people doing the work? When we think about controlling our work in progress for predictability, the other thing we are also doing is we want to make sure that we're giving the team the data and the signals to make those decisions around what to work on next. And if we're talking about it through the lens of predictability, that's again where work item age is going to become so important. So if we know that we've forecasted work or planned our work around a service level expectation of, let's say, 10 days per ticket, then what we want to do is make sure that the team has the information that they need to organize around work that's aging, that's close to that or aging beyond that. I could probably spend a whole nother hour talking about dates, but one of the things that always makes me the saddest about our industry is when I hear dev teams say that dates get set arbitrarily and that they have no control over hitting them. And what can be so important and empowering about this notion of controlling your work in progress and looking at the age of items in your system is that it starts to give your teams control. All of a sudden, they have the ability to hit a date, to respond to the information about the work that's in their system, and feel like they are empowered to be able to deliver on time. And then again, we're talking here about sustainable pace. So how do we help prevent that burnout that we've, I think, all been seeing in our industry and in other industries as well, but to make sure that we are taking care of ourselves. So how do we do this? The first thing here, and what we're trying to do is minimize heroics to get things over the finish line. But the first thing we want to do is forecast our delivery dates based on past data. You know, take that bathroom example, right? I want to know that most bathrooms take 4 or 5 days to paint, and that includes all of those things that are hard to account for. I see so many folks estimate work and they'll say, you know, we asked the team how long this would take and they said it will take us 15 days, but we always go ahead and add an extra 30% to that because that's how much we're always off. If we forecast with past data, we get all of that variability baked in. We also want to make sure that we're always having the conversation around finishing that work in progress first. So how do we finish work that's in flight? If I've got capacity, how do I help get something over the finish line instead of starting something that's going to be added into the queue and creating that growing pile of unfinished work? And then how do we focus on continuously reforecasting? So what do we mean by continuously reforecasting? I think it would be lovely if I started an epic and it had 20 stories in it and stayed at 20 stories through the duration of that epic. I've never seen that happen. So what we want to talk about here is how do we make sure that we're getting an organization comfortable with this concept of continuously looking at the data, which can be scope, right? So adding or removing stories. It could be the pace of the team. So is our throughput going up or down during that time that we're working? It could also be the capacity of the team. So somebody asked the question of new folks joining the team. How do we make sure that we're incorporating things like that into that forecast and making sure that we're changing that date based on new things coming in? So last quote here is beware the barrenness of a busy life, right? We want to be productive, not busy. We want to focus on value, not allocation or making sure that our team is at 100% capacity. Let's work on the right things, not just all the things. So just to recap why our WIP matters so much, we want to, by controlling the amount of work that we have in progress, it's going to bring us focus, flexibility, follow through, and predictability. So focus, the less work that we have in progress forces us to choose what matters most. Think of our turkey in the oven. Flexibility, less inventory or less things in flight is going to allow us to change direction more easily. Think of the snacks in my small pantry. Follow through, constrained capacity requires you to create space by completing something before starting something new. And then lastly, predictability. So a consistent amount of work in flight creates consistent delivery time. So think of that Southwest Airlines model and how they optimized for getting folks onto the plane in a predictable amount of time. And the last thing here is we tend to think of WIP as something that's being a WIP limit, right? That's what we always, when I talk about work in progress, everyone's head goes to WIP limits as being the control. It often is, but when we think of WIP and work in progress, let's shift the way that we're thinking about this away from being a limit to how much I can do and it being a go light for when I have capacity to take on something new. This is a picture of an airport. I've seen these in a lot of airports and shopping malls recently, where you can look down the row and it's going to tell you, is there capacity to park in this row? And I can see which spots have capacity with that green light there. So think of your WIP not as a limit to how much you can do, but as a go light for when you have capacity to start the next thing. And then as you start to focus on finding your flow of work, there are two things we want to do. It's not just about controlling our work in progress. It's also about managing aging work. So bringing both of those concepts together to help us focus on the flow of getting things done. Controlling work in progress is going to help us with that focus and flexibility. And then managing work item age and batch size is going to help us with that follow through and predictability. If you're interested in learning more about any of these concepts, there are courses and online assessments that you can check out at prokanban.org. We have 2 courses that are live, applying professional Kanban and applying metrics for predictability. And then I'll be at the Pixis booth. I know the booths are virtual, but you will have the option to chat and ask more questions there. We've also got an online guide available that you can download on the Pixis website under Agile Resources to help you get started defining your Kanban workflow. So I'll pause there, Nicholas, and see if we have any other questions that have come up.
We do have, unfortunately, we only have like 5 minutes left, so yeah. We'll do what we can. Let's go with the first one. Should we apply a WIP to a team or each team member?
Yes, it depends. So I think if your team members are highly specialized, and I do see this sometimes with some security teams where there's really only one person that can do one thing. I also have seen this for marketing teams applying Kanban where they are highly specialized. They may consider applying WIP per person. For most teams I work with, I would apply it for the team, especially if I'm trying to drive that behavior and that culture of shared ownership and shared deliverables versus individual, an individual queue of work. So I would say most times it's at the team level and looking at what's our capacity as a team to take on that new work.
You said that we should learn to say no for new work coming in. What about work that we don't have choice to accept? How do we manage our WIP in those cases?
Yeah, there's a couple ways to think about this, and I'm going to lean on the security example again here. So, I think it can be important here that you leave capacity if you have a high volume of unplanned work for that work to go into your to-do column or your next to pull column. For a lot of teams in those situations, what I'll do is I'll say, if you have a WIP limit, let's say of 4 items on your to-do column, it doesn't mean that you need to put 4 items into that column every time it drops below 4. You might not want to plan what's going to go next in that column until there's capacity in your first stage of your board to pull that item in. So go back to that example of the stalls to pay for your parking, right? If I'm filling that to-do column, the minute there's space in it, when there's capacity available, those might not be the most important things anymore. And so I want to make sure that I'm leaving some space available to plan just in time when that capacity becomes available for something to pull, because it might not, if I plan today, it might, and capacity is available tomorrow morning. What's most important might be different.
Before last one, how to manage uncertainty in a way that the planning is realistic and accurate at the same time? Yeah,
great question. When we think about planning here, what we want to look at is probability and likelihood. There's always, nothing is definite here. This isn't, we aren't able to say with 100% confidence that we're going to hit a date. And the amount of variability that your team has is probably different even inside of one organization. So what we want to use is a probabilistic forecast that's going to tell us, based on the past data we have, there's a certain percentage likelihood of us being able to hit this date. And a lot of times we use 85% because it's going to capture more of our data set and still acknowledge that there's 15% there of outliers that may not fall within that range. But it's going to vary from organization to organization, right? If you're a startup and maybe you're throwing a lot at the wall and trying to get your feet under you, you might be able to forecast with a 70% probability of hitting something. If you're dealing in a highly regulatory environment, maybe you're looking more at like 90%. So understanding what your risk tolerance is going to be the first part of asking that question, and then leveraging your data so that when you share a forecast for something, you're also sharing the likelihood of hitting that forecast. And then, typically we want to move away from it just being one date to being a range. So being able to say there's an 85% chance that we will finish this epic between November 4th and 8th, right? Instead of saying it will be done on the 6th. So it's kind of shifting the way we communicate about those deliverables and deadlines.
Thank you. Well, let's go for a last 1 minute answer. So how do you balance when team members are shared along different projects, each with individual WIP?
Yeah, so I think, and this is very common, I have the work follow them. So if I am, let's say I'm a designer or a UX person and I am supporting 2 different teams, the work that I'm working on needs to show up on both teams' boards. Because if I have work in 2 places for 2 different groups, I'm doubling my WIP. So what I do in that case is I might try to show in a different way that the work that I'm working on will follow me to both places, so that if team A has a request that I'm working on, that would show up on team B's board as well, so that they can see that that's what's consuming my capacity at the moment.
Thank you very much, Colleen.
Yeah,
I enjoyed a lot. Thank you, everybody. Thank you so much.
I hope to talk to you more there.
Yes, of course. So you can stay here for a minute. Cal will come back, and then we'll go on for the rest of the day. Hello, Cal.
Merci Nicolas. Merci Colleen pour cette super présentation. Je vous rappelle que les prix aux utilisateurs les plus actifs vont être dévoilés sur les médias sociaux à la suite de l'événement un peu après 17 h aujourd'hui. Donc, merci à l'avance d'être ponctuel pour les conférences qui se poursuivent à partir de 14h10. C'est simple, il vous suffira de cliquer sur l'onglet Programmation dans Swapcard afin d'accéder aux conférences. D'ici là, je vous souhaite une bonne pause.